Y'all, I like games, and I like talking about games. I like discovering things in games and discovering new games to play. It's one of the reasons that I'm doing this in the hobby is I like to wring the most out of gaming and broaden my horizons. And as part of that, I tend to be pretty forgiving about little nuisances in games, but sometimes I have to get a little bit petty. I have to talk about things that make me angry when it comes to games, mainly because even in games that I love, there are what I see as glaring problems that shouldn't be anywhere near games that are still being made today. So we're going to get a little bit petty. Just a little bit petty in talking about my top 10 gaming pet peeves, but in the spirit of not just punching down, we're going to talk about these 10 pet peeves in the context of examples from some of my absolute favorite games, both to show that, these are games that I love and I get it, but also these are still some of the shining examples of the greatest things that our hobby has to offer, and yet we are still kind of dealing with some of this stuff. We got some growing to do, so I would like to see this as a call to action that we can do better. So here are the Cardboard Herald's top 10 gaming pet peeves. Number 10, palette swapped illustrations. I mean, come on. This is something that I think largely we've moved past, but even in Flamme Rouge, one of the most iconic racing games of all time that is still constantly recommended, even by myself, we have racers who on your player mat are barely changed from one another and clearly are the same model, but have little different illustrations to the cards where they're wearing different colored shirts. You went through the process of having different identifiable colors, but they are truly just palette swaps of those shirts. It feels so lazy. I mean, I get it. Artwork is expensive, but at the same time, you had to print this material. You are putting out a product. It feels like you could go the extra mile. So anytime where there's just a palette swap of one color to another in different player factions or identities, it just, I die a little inside. Number 9 is a sexy but space-wasting insert, which is kind of like a little double tap. It's just a little cherry on the top of pissing me off, because not only do you have a game like Splendor, a wonderful game with beautiful components that could be fit into something that's like a 1/10 of the size of the box that it comes in, but the box that it comes in has this perfectly sculpted insert that only gives you exactly enough room for the components themselves and nothing else. So it's already laughing at you for wasting so much space and packing so much air, but then they say, hey, get yourself an expansion. It ain't going to fit in this beautifully crafted insert that we have here. So it's just like an ultimate waste. That insert just gets thrown out the door. So now I have more recycling material to have. It's already an insult to have a largely empty box. And then when that largely empty box is crafted in such a way to pretend that it's something much more substantial than it is just demeaning. Number 8 is where we start actually getting into game design itself. And something that just always strikes me as a weakness in game design is overly homogenized or equitable values. And the way that I think about this is like in Duelosaur Island, where you have all these different dinosaurs that are different types and different shapes, and they cost different DNA in order to create them, but the value exchanges are so tight and rigid that effectively there is zero difference between the types of DNA that you're using, between the dinosaurs that you're using. It saps all the life and flavor and color out of it, and it also undermines the sense that you are investing in something as you play the game, that you're sculpting a strategy, that you are really building up to something or risking something when everything has too precise of an equitable value, even if that's kind of hidden a little bit underneath the hood. As soon as you start noticing this in a game where everything has a rough exchange rate of any action essentially being the same value as another action, it just takes a lot of the fun and interest out of that game. Number 7 is a lack of colorblind accessibility options. And I'm not colorblind, I should say that right up front, but I do have some fellow gamers who are, and I know that it's a prevalent problem that there's a lack of colorblind accessibility options in many games, such as Five Tribes, a game that, if you are colorblind, is virtually unplayable, or at least certain types of colorblind, but also having just color be the visual distinction between different items on a board reduces general readability and just kind of makes a colorful mess. Whereas if you have different shapes of pieces or different shapes printed on pieces or some other visual identifier that can help you make distinctions between all the different sets, it allows you to bank information a lot easier. It helps with retention of rules. It helps with distinction of these as separate identifiers of groups of items. And also it makes it so more gamers can play your game. So when you don't have colorblind accessibility options, not only does it dramatically limit the pool of players that are going to be able to play your game, but also it just makes your game a lot harder to get a visual read on. We can grow beyond this. 6 is lack of components. And I'm talking Eldritch Horror here. No, I don't mean that Eldritch Horror didn't have all the components you must have to play. But y'all, that game came with 4 dice. 4 freaking dice. That is the biggest joke in the world because you are almost always going to be rolling more than 4 dice, and they expect you to roll 4 dice and then pick up some of those and roll them again because you're rolling 15 dice to fight a Shoggoth this turn. I mean, it's ridiculous and it's insulting anytime that a game doesn't give you a full complement of the components that you would realistically need in order to play. I mean, I'm fine sharing dice with the other players at the table so long as you give me a realistic amount of dice or coins or whatever non-component limited aspect of the game that I'm going to need in order to feel like I'm not having to bring extra material into a typical game session. It feels cheap. It feels insulting. It's just bad. It's bad. Number 5 is back to some game design choices, and I'm bringing up what is for many people their favorite game of all time, and that is Scythe. I love Scythe, but man, do I not like the ending of Scythe or other games that have an abrupt triggered game end. I mean, there are a lot of games that end at a defined point because you hit a certain number of rounds or whatever it is, but that's something that all players can see coming. Whereas Scythe, it's a triggered game end condition where once someone puts 6 stars out, then their turn is the last turn and there's no ability for anyone else to recover from that. And yeah, I get it. There's some design philosophy stuff there, wanting other players to pay attention to everyone else at the table, looking at realistic capabilities, and then also talking about well, does it undermine the value of movement if other people can take a turn? I don't really care. It just, there's a better solution out there than having someone be able to both trigger and finalize the game all on that one single turn without any repercussions for anyone else. It's annoying. It's not fun. It kind of takes away some of the agency for everyone else, and it just makes it feel like, oh, okay, well, I guess the game just ended. Number 4, games with squared corners on cards. It's horrible. Why is this still done? I don't understand it. If you have cardstock cards and they have squared corners, you realize they're just going to get mushed, right? I love Discoveries, the Journals of Lewis and Clark. I think it's a brilliant game, but it's one of the most insulting things ever that they have an entire stack of 55 cards where one corner is squared and the rest are rounded. It's, I guess, like an aesthetic design choice that they made, but it's a really bad one. And the fact that it got so close also makes me feel like they fell so far. And any time in which I'm playing with cards and it has squared corners, it doesn't feel good. They're pokey, they get mushed, they don't function well. It's just bad design as part of a user experience, a component quality issue. I never want to play with squared corner cards again. And if you do, well, you're a bad person. Number 3 is inconsistent terminology in a game. And Dune Imperium, I love you, baby. You're a game that made a huge splash on this entire hobby recently. But what is up with this Fremen bond, where it's a shorthand for giving you some sort of bonus on some cards that are based off of 2 cards that are actively in play in your side of the camp that have Fremen on them, and you just assume that that means something, but at the same time, you have the Bene Gesserit who say that if you've played another Bene Gesserit, then it blah, 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 which means exactly the same thing, but having 2 different ways of approaching the exact same concept in relation to the exact same component, cards, and their identifiers, the affiliation of those, just undermines that you actually understand the game. Like, if you are playing the game and you're like, oh, Fremen bond, okay, look it up in the rules. Okay, it means this. Okay, now the Bene Gesserit cards don't have Bene Gesserit bonds, so okay, maybe they don't mean the same thing. What am I missing here? Why is one? It's terrible. We have a hard enough time grasping all the rules of the games that are presented to us. It makes it feel like it didn't get to an editor, that someone didn't look over this. Or if they did and they let it slide, what were you thinking? You could have had consistency, and instead it's just disparate and not great. I don't know. I do not have a Fremen bond. Number 2 could be any game. Well, not any game. Not every game. But most games, including, I don't know, Spirit Island or Imperial Settlers or Dune Imperium or any of these other games, which are some of my favorite games of all time, but it's big, floppy rulebooks. I know, the temptation to have this enormous frickin' box here and be like, well, I have space in order to make this rulebook that's going to fit. And you could just have this enormous floppy rulebook that is terrible and unwieldy and hard to distinguish different sections and doesn't fit well on the table and isn't good to reference as you play. It's abysmal. I hate these enormous rulebooks. We gotta be done with them. They are hard to read. Like, if you're trying to read in advance and you're like, oh, I'm just going to stay in bed and read this rulebook, they're hard to have on the table. Rulebooks should be treated with the same degree of care and precision when they're being created as any other game component. And if I have this big, unwieldy, nasty, floppy rulebook, I'm not going to be able to use that for anything. It's a waste of space. It's a waste of time. The rulebooks that are more concise or more easy to fit into your hands, that are more easy to flip through, those are the rulebooks that are succeeding in conveying information, which is the point of rulebooks in the first place. So yeah, I get a little irrationally upset when it comes to these big floppy rulebooks, but it's not number 1, but only because I made an entire other video about big floppy rulebooks, so I figured I'd let it pass and be at a number 2 here, which brings us to the top. Number 1, my pet peeve, is implicit rather than explicit rules. Or really just not having clearly defined rules in your freaking rulebook. And you know what, Sleeping Gods? You're great. You are a darling. You are just a peach. But how the campaign ends, if you're in the middle of a campaign and you're like, oh, geez, we've been playing like 12 hours of this game across several sessions, how does the game end? And you start looking through the rule books and you're like, there was something about totems. How does the game end? I can see game loss. Well, are we supposed to play to a certain time? Do we just, I think it was supposed to be 7 totems. Do we just hang it up at that point? And you start looking through the rule books, and there is not a clear, like, this is what the game is and what you need to expect out of the game. Now, there is something that references, I don't want to get into too many spoilers, but when a certain deck runs out several times, you read entry F something. Well, that's really what's going to trigger the end of the game, but that's not clearly defined anywhere. And this is a problem. I mean, Sleeping Gods is a wonderful game, but clearly by the number of questions that are on the internet about this exact issue and the amount of time that my group spent trying to figure out, like, wait, is there something we're supposed to do as soon as we get to 7 totems, or is there a certain number of totems, or what makes the end of the campaign happen? Because this is kind of like a free-form jazz type of thing. That's a problem. And there are all kinds of examples of this in our hobby where there's something that the rulebook kind of implies but doesn't clearly define. And I get it that if you're trying to hide certain information, or in the event of a storytelling game, you're trying to hide spoilers or keep certain things a surprise, still having a very clearly defined section on what to anticipate in the event that someone is looking for that information, you need to have it available. And there are so many offenders in this regard, which is why the amazing community at Board Game Geek has grown to what it is, because there's so many people answering these questions, so many FAQs, so many erratas. And I get it, writing rules is hard. Making sure that you've addressed all the use case scenarios for so many different moving parts is hard. But especially on fundamental concepts in games, when there are so many different types of games out there, it is really important that you use explicit directions, not implicit directions. That is my number one pet peeve on all games in this hobby, anytime that it comes up. And of course, on these examples, bear in mind before you start knocking over my door, these are all on games that I love and have in my collection and routinely play and have overcome these issues, but they still nag at me anytime that I break them out. But I want to know, what are your top 10 pet peeves, or just your number one pet peeve? And do you think that some of these are solvable, or are some of my issues just kind of blown entirely out of proportion? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching, thanks for supporting, thanks for being such an amazing community where you can say these things out loud and hopefully not have the pitchforks at your door. I love doing this, and I hope you love me doing it too. Thank you so much for watching. I've been Jack for the Cardboard Herald.